The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It started, as these things often do, with something ridiculous, a $50 fine. A paltry sum, insignificant really, yet it represented a declaration of war, a gauntlet thrown down by someone who gravely miscalculated their opponent. What she didn't know, what no one in this meticulously manicured suburban cul-de-sac knew, was that I had inherited something far more valuable than a lakeside home. I had inherited the lake itself. And I promise you, dear listener, you won't see how this ending came to pass. My name is Julian Thorne, and 6 months prior, I had been a corporate lawyer specializing in mergers and acquisitions, a field that demanded a mind both sharp and relentlessly analytical, a temperament cool under pressure, and a penchant for dismantling complex structures to find their hidden vulnerabilities. My days were a blur of high-stakes negotiations, hostile takeovers, and the intricate dance of legal maneuvering. But then Eleanor, my wife, the anchor of my chaotic life, was gone. A swift, brutal illness had stolen her from me, leaving behind a silence so profound it echoed in every room of our once vibrant home. The corporate world, with its incessant demands and ruthless pace, became unbearable. The victories felt hollow, the losses crushing. I found myself adrift, seeking not conquest but quietude. My escape came in the form of a small, unpretentious house nestled on the banks of a serene, private lake at the edge of a sprawling, newly developed Windermere Point community. It had been Eleanor's grandfather's place, a simple cabin he'd built with his own hands, later expanded by her parents. It was a place steeped in generations of her family's memories, a sanctuary Eleanor and I had always intended to retire to, though we'd never quite made it. Now, it was just me and the lapping water. The property itself was modest, certainly not as grand as the McMansions that had sprung up around the lake in recent years, but its value wasn't measured in square footage or granite countertops. It was measured in the quiet solace it offered, the way the morning mist clung to the water, the familiar song of the loons, the scent of pine needles and damp earth. This lake, to me, was more than just a body of water. It was a living, breathing connection to Eleanor. We had spent countless weekends here, fishing from its glassy surface, gliding silently in our small electric boat, simply existing in its calming presence. It was my balm, my refuge, the only place where the sharp edges of grief seemed to soften. I had settled into a quiet routine. Mornings were for coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the water in hues of orange and pink. Afternoons were often spent in my little electric boat, a sleek, silent vessel that barely disturbed the water surface. It was compact, lightweight, and specifically designed for tranquil, private waters. I would glide out to the middle, cut the engine, and simply drift, sometimes fishing, sometimes just watching the clouds, feeling Eleanor's presence in the stillness. I had even cleared a small, rocky cove near my property line, a natural alcove, where I could pull the boat up onto a patch of gravel and keep it out of the main channel. It was practical, unobtrusive, and entirely on my property. Or so I thought. My peace, however, was destined to be short-lived. Just as a placid pond can be violently disturbed by a carelessly thrown stone, my carefully constructed tranquility was shattered by the arrival of Brenda Albright, the self-appointed empress of Windermere Point Homeowners Association. I had seen her around, of course. She was impossible to miss. Her car, a gleaming white Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, was always parked with an air of entitlement that suggested parking regulations were for lesser mortals. Her clothes were designer, her handbags ostentatious, and her hair perpetually styled into that severe, helmet-like bob that has become the universal signifier for, "I want to speak to the manager," seemed to vibrate with an unseen, self-generated hum of authority. Brenda, I quickly learned, didn't walk. She strode. She didn't speak, she pronounced. And she certainly didn't tolerate dissent. The confrontation occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. I was wiping down the hull of my electric boat, which rested quietly in its small, natural cove, when Brenda's imposing figure appeared at the edge of my property line. She wore an expensive tracksuit, its material probably costing more than my boat, and a scowl that could curdle milk. Her hands were planted on her hips, an archetypal posture of righteous indignation. "Mr. Thorne," she announced, her voice piercing the afternoon quiet like a siren. "We need to discuss this." She gestured imperiously at my boat. I straightened, towel in hand. "Discuss what, Ms. Albright?" I tried to keep my tone neutral, though a flicker of annoyance, a primal warning of impending bureaucratic absurdity, sparked within me. "This," she repeated, sweeping her hand dramatically towards the lake and then back to my boat. "This entire situation is simply unacceptable. The Homeowners Association has clear regulations regarding watercraft and common area usage. Your vessel, Mr. Thorne, is in direct violation." I looked at my boat, then at the quiet cove, then back at her. "My boat is an electric vessel, Ms. Albright. It's small, quiet, and kept on my property in a natural alcove out of the main traffic flow. How is it in violation?" She scoffed, a dismissive sound that conveyed her profound contempt for my apparent ignorance. "First, it is an unapproved vessel type. We only permit rowboats and kayaks here, nothing with an engine. Secondly, this alcove, as you call it, is considered common property. The entire lake shoreline, up to 20 feet inland from the high water mark, is HOA common area. Your boat, therefore, is illegally moored on HOA property and is an obstruction. It's an eyesore, frankly," she sniffed, as if the very sight of my modest boat offended her refined sensibilities. "An unapproved vessel?" I repeated, my eyebrows raising slightly. "I assure you, this boat causes no noise pollution, no chemical runoff. It's perfectly ecologically sound." "Ecology is beside the point, Mr. Thorne," she snapped, pulling a clipboard from behind her back. It was precisely the kind of clipboard one would expect an HOA president to carry. Pristine, probably never seen an actual drop of sweat or dirt, and filled with precisely laminated forms. "It's about adherence to the rules. The rules protect our property values, Mr. Thorne. Rules protect our idyllic community. And frankly, your presence and this thing," she gestured to my boat again, "disrupts that." She flipped open the clipboard, dramatically retrieved a pre-printed form, and flourished a pen. "Effective immediately, you are being issued a fine of $50 for a violation of Article 7, subsection B, of the Windermere Point Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, unauthorized watercraft and obstruction of common area. Furthermore, you have 48 hours to remove this vessel, or will be impounded by an HOA contracted service, and you will be billed for all removal and storage fees." She shoved the form into my hand, her eyes glinting with a perverse satisfaction. I stared at the fine notice, then at her, a profound sense of absurdity washing over me. $50. It was nothing, but the sheer arrogance, the condescending tone, the arbitrary nature of the rule. It ignited something cold and hard within me. "Ms. Albright," I said, my voice perhaps a little too calm, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This cove, and indeed a significant portion of the lake itself, is not common property." She laughed, a short, sharp bark that grated on my ears. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, are you quite all right? Perhaps you're still adjusting. I assure you, I have reviewed the plats and deeds. I am the president of this HOA. I know every inch of this community's land ownership. The lake is a shared amenity. Always has been. Now, I suggest you tend to this matter promptly, unless you wish for a far more substantial penalty." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving me holding the flimsy paper, feeling the familiar stirrings of a war I hadn't realized I was about to declare. The initial humiliation and anger at Brenda's unjust actions simmered within me. $50. 48 hours. My boat, my sanctuary, deemed an eyesore, my first instinct, a deeply ingrained habit from years of navigating bureaucratic nonsense, was to simply comply. Pay the fine, move the boat, choose peace over principle. I was exhausted from grief, weary of conflict. All I wanted was to drift on the lake and be left alone. I retreated into the quiet solace of my study, the fine notice lying like an unwelcome guest on my desk. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in melancholic purples and grays. I stared out the window, the image of Brenda's sneering face superimposed on the tranquil water. That arrogant dismissal, the casual cruelty in her voice when she mentioned my adjustment period, it was an insidious jab, implying my grief somehow rendered me incompetent. It wasn't just about a $50 fine anymore. It was about the fundamental right to exist peacefully in my own home, on my own land, and to honor the legacy Eleanor had left me. Then, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was Eleanor, sitting beside me on this very porch, her arm linked through mine, as her grandfather, a wiry, stoic man who barely spoke, but whose eyes held a profound wisdom, recounted stories of the lake. He had described it not as a part of some subdivision, but as something ancient, something that had always been theirs. He spoke of surveying markers, old deeds, and the peculiar way the family's land wrapped around the water. This lake, Julian, Eleanor had said once, echoing her grandfather, it's part of who we are. It's family. That memory, that quiet affirmation of legacy, was the spark. The sleeping giant, as my colleagues used to call my dormant capacity for ruthless strategic thinking, began to stir. I had spent decades advising corporations on hostile takeovers, identifying weaknesses in their opponents' legal structures, and orchestrating intricate financial maneuvers. My mind, usually a whirlwind of complex calculations and contingency plans, had been idling for months, dulled by sorrow. But now it engaged. Brenda Albright had just pressed the wrong button. She had declared war on my peace, on my sanctuary, and by extension, on Eleanor's memory. I would not be bullied, not by grief, and certainly not by a self-important HOA president with a clipboard. The decision to fight, once made, brought with it a cold, exhilarating clarity. My professional expertise, once employed for the benefit of distant shareholders, was now repurposed for a deeply personal cause. I stood up, walked over to my overflowing bookshelves, and pulled down dusty legal texts on property law, riparian rights, and historical land grants. My brain, once sluggish, clicked into gear, hungry for information, for the puzzle pieces that would form my counterattack. I began my investigation meticulously, systematically, just as I would have approached a multi-million-dollar acquisition. First, the public records, county clerk's office, local historical society archives, the city's planning department. I started with Eleanor's grandfather's original purchase of the land, tracing it back through successive owners, looking for any anomaly, any forgotten detail. I cross-referenced plat maps, surveying records, and the Windermere Point Development's initial filings. The HOA bylaws were my next target. I requested a full copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, their articles of incorporation, and every amendment ever filed. I devoured them, line by line, looking for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything that might contradict Brenda's grand pronouncements. The initial searches were tedious, filled with dry legal jargon and endless pages of antiquated script. Days bled into nights, fueled by strong coffee and a singular focus. My study, once a quiet room for reflection, transformed into a war room, littered with maps, legal pads, and highlighted documents. My computer hummed late into the night as I navigated online databases, cross-referencing names, dates, and property descriptions. The legal mind, once restless, was finally at peace, engaged in its truest purpose, problem-solving. And then it happened. The eureka moment, as clear and sudden as a lightning strike. I was poring over a faded, brittle document, a land grant from the late 19th century, tucked away in a dusty county archive. It was a transfer of a large parcel of land encompassing what would one day become Windermere Point, from a wealthy landowner to a timber company. But there was a specific handwritten addendum, almost an afterthought, referring to a smaller, rectangular parcel marked Lake Thorne. The deed stipulated that the entire bed and banks of Lake Thorne, from the high water mark inward 10 feet, were to remain perpetually under the ownership of the original grantor's family, their heirs, and assigns. It was an archaic clause designed to protect private fishing and hunting rights, common in the era. And the grantor's family? It was Eleanor's ancestral surname. My heart began to pound, not with anger, but with a profound, almost dizzying sense of vindication. I cross-referenced the property identification numbers, the meets and bounds descriptions, the historical surveys. Every single document confirmed it. Eleanor's great-great-grandfather, in a stroke of prescient family planning, had carved out a permanent, private claim to the lake itself, even as the surrounding land changed hands. When Eleanor's grandfather had purchased his lakeside plot, this specific clause had been inherited along with it. The HOA, in its rush to develop and its arrogant assumption of universal control, had clearly never bothered to trace the land title back far enough. They likely relied on the developer's more recent plat maps, which conveniently omitted this inconvenient truth. The lake wasn't a shared amenity. It was and always had been private property. Mine. The irony was delicious. Brenda had declared my boat illegal on her common property lake, when in fact, the entire lake and a significant portion of its immediate shoreline was my undisputed personal domain. I didn't just own the property next to the lake, I owned the lake itself. The truth was a weapon, cold and polished, ready for deployment. With the revelation burning bright in my mind, the next logical step was to seek counsel. While my own legal background was extensive, property law, particularly historical deeds and riparian rights, was a specialized field. I needed a trusted, objective expert to validate my findings and help me strategize. My thoughts immediately turned to David Sterling, my old mentor from my corporate law firm. David had been a senior partner when I was a junior associate, a brilliant, tenacious litigator with a reputation for unraveling the most tangled legal knots. He had retired a few years before I did, moving to a quiet coastal town, but we still kept in touch, exchanging emails and the occasional phone call. I called him that evening, barely containing my excitement. "David," I began, skipping pleasantries, "I need your eyes on something truly remarkable." He listened patiently as I laid out the convoluted history of the lake, the discovery of the old land grant, and Brenda Albright's recent campaign of petty tyranny. I could almost hear the gears turning in his sharp mind. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Julian," he finally said, his voice slow, measured, "are you absolutely certain of these details? The original grantor, the specific language, the chain of title?" "I've cross-referenced everything, David," I assured him. "Public records, county archives, even old family documents Eleanor's grandfather kept. The language is unequivocal, the entire bed and banks. To remain perpetually under the ownership of the grantor's heirs and assigns." Another pause. Then, David let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. You didn't just find a deed, Julian, you found a loaded weapon. A nuclear warhead, in fact. This changes everything. It means the HOA has been operating under a fundamental misconception of property rights for decades, possibly since the community was first platted." We spent the next hour strategizing. David, with his extensive experience in real estate litigation, helped me refine my understanding of the legal implications. He confirmed that if my findings were accurate, the HOA had no legal standing to regulate the lake, impose fines for its use, or claim any portion of its shoreline as common area. Their entire premise was built on quicksand. "Your play here, Julian," David advised, "isn't just to defend against Brenda's petty fines. It's to utterly dismantle her and the HOA's authority over that lake. You have the ultimate leverage. The question is, how do you want to play it? Do you want to settle quietly? Or do you want to make an example?" My gaze drifted to the framed photo of Eleanor on my desk. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes held a fierce light. "She taught me that bullies only stop when they're made to," I said, my voice firm. "Brenda Albright needs a lesson in humility, and the community needs to understand what's truly been happening under her reign." David chuckled. "My boy, I always knew you had a killer instinct. So the strategy is clear. Let her overplay her hand. Let her dig her own grave. Every further aggressive action she takes against you, Every ridiculous fine, every public humiliation. That's just more ammunition for your case. We build an irrefutable dossier. Then, we drop the hammer. With David's validation, my strategic plan began to take shape, meticulously detailed, like a complex chess game where every move was anticipated, every countermove considered. The goal wasn't merely to win. It was to achieve a decisive, public, and irreversible victory. I wanted Brenda to realize the full extent of her arrogance, to witness the collapse of her self-made empire. Phase 1. Evidence gathering. I became a silent, omnipresent observer. I invested in discreet, motion-activated security cameras, strategically placed to capture any activity on or around my property line and the cove where my boat rested. They were tiny, barely visible, but their digital eyes missed nothing. My smartphone, once a tool for corporate communication, became my primary recording device. Every interaction with Brenda, every intimidating letter, every ludicrous HOA notice was documented. I would record our conversations, always legally, in a single-party consent state, ensuring I had an unassailable record of her condescension and threats. But Brenda wasn't the only one suffering. I knew she had a history of this. During my initial research, I had encountered disgruntled residents online, in neighborhood forums, quietly complaining about the HOA's punitive fines, arbitrary rules, and Brenda's dictatorial style. Now, I reached out to them, cautiously at first, then more openly. I organized discreet meetings, coffee at local cafes, or quiet conversations in my living room, away from prying eyes. I listened patiently as they recounted their own tales of woe. Excessive fines for minor landscaping infractions, ridiculous architectural demands, public shaming at HOA meetings, even veiled threats about property values. There was the elderly couple, the Millers, who had been fined for a small, tasteful bird bath because it attracted vermin. There was the young family, the Sanchezes, who had been ordered to repaint their front door a specific shade of beige because its original blue detracted from the community aesthetic. And most egregiously, there was Mark, a quiet accountant who had dared to question Brenda's financial transparency at an HOA meeting, only to find his garbage cans accidentally tipped over. Every week, in a series of anonymous complaints filed against him for noise pollution. I asked them to compile every document, every email, every fine notice. I recorded their testimonies, making sure they understood they could be called upon to support my claims. The dossier grew, thick with Brenda's abuses of power, a testament to her reign of terror. It wasn't just about my lake anymore. It was about justice for the entire community. I was assembling an arsenal, piece by careful piece. My first countermove was subtle, a whisper before the storm. I drafted, with David's meticulous review, a formal letter addressed to the entire HOA board, not just Brenda. It was professional, legally precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It formally disputed the $50 fine, citing the specific lack of statutory or bylaw authority for regulating a private body of water. It also requested, under the relevant state laws governing homeowner associations, specific documentation regarding the ownership and chain of title for Lake Thorne, along with all recorded easements and declarations. The letter concluded with a polite but firm warning that further attempts to enforce unauthorized regulations on the lake would result in legal action. I had it delivered via certified mail, return receipt requested, a clear paper trail established. I expected a measured, if annoyed, response. What I got was a full-blown tantrum. Brenda, blinded by her own hubris and convinced of her unassailable authority, saw my letter not as a legitimate legal challenge, but as a personal affront, an act of insubordination from a new resident. She viewed it as a direct challenge to her carefully constructed dominion. Her retaliation was swift and disproportionate. First, the fine was immediately quadrupled to $200, with an additional administrative fee of $100 for frivolous correspondence. Then came a letter, not from the HOA's legal counsel, but personally signed by Brenda, filled with thinly veiled threats about legal costs and the power of the HOA to protect its assets. She accused me, in writing, of being a disruptive element, and hinted that she would seek to have my property classified as a nuisance. But the true overreach, the move that solidified my resolve and banished any lingering desire for a peaceful resolution, came a week later. I woke one morning to find my little electric boat, my sanctuary, gone from its quiet cove. In its place was a crudely printed sign hammered into the ground. HOA property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. My blood ran cold. The cameras, bless their silent digital hearts, had captured everything. In the dead of night, a flatbed truck, clearly marked with a local towing company's logo, had backed into the cove. Two burly men, directed by Brenda Albright herself, had physically dragged my boat out of the water, onto the truck, and driven off. The cameras also recorded Brenda, illuminated by the truck's headlights, standing by, watching, a triumphant, almost predatory smile on her face. She even had the audacity to record herself on her phone, narrating something about reclaiming common property. This wasn't just about a fine or a boat anymore. This was theft. This was blatant disregard for private property. But the line, the true unforgivable line, was crossed a few days later at the monthly HOA meeting which I attended, armed with my recordings and my cold resolve. Brenda stood at the podium, basking in the glow of her self-importance. She droned on about landscaping budgets and community events. Then, she turned to new business. And finally, she announced, her eyes sweeping over the room, landing on me. We have the ongoing issue with Mr. Thorne's adjustments. Some residents, myself included, have found his recent behavior, including his rather aggressive legal correspondence, to be deeply concerning. We understand grief is a difficult process, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. But it does not excuse insubordination or attempts to circumvent community regulations. One must move on, after all. The HOA cannot allow personal sorrow to disrupt the harmony and property values of Windermere Point. You have ignored warnings. You have resisted cooperation. And frankly, your recent actions have been disrespectful to the memory of all those who built this community. She had dared to twist my grief, my profound sorrow for Eleanor, into a weapon against me, publicly implying I was unstable, using my loss as an excuse. She had dared to disrespect Eleanor's memory, to suggest her legacy was somehow disruptive, the casual cruelty, the calculated attempt to publicly shame me, to paint me as emotionally unbalanced, was the final, irreversible mistake. The chess game was over. It was time for the tactical nuclear strike. The execution of my master plan was swift and precise. I wanted a public unmasking, a dramatic reveal that would leave no doubt about Brenda's deceit and the sheer audacity of her reign. David Sterling had pulled some strings, leveraging old favors. My lawsuit, far more comprehensive than just a property dispute, was filed not against the HOA, but against Brenda Albright personally and against the specific HOA board members who had supported her actions. The charges were damning: conversion of property for the boat, intentional infliction of emotional distress for the public mockery of my grief, breach of fiduciary duty, gross negligence, and potentially misrepresentation of facts to the community. We also sought injunctive relief to prevent her and the HOA from further attempts to regulate the lake. But the lawsuit was only the legal hammer. The strategic coup de grace was to be delivered at the annual HOA meeting, a mandatory event that Brenda herself had grandly advertised as a celebration of community success. It was the perfect stage. I had spent days preparing my presentation, boiling down decades of legal minutiae into a concise, easily digestible narrative. I had secured a court order based on the preliminary evidence, demanding that Brenda and the HOA provide all requested historical deeds and documents at the meeting itself for public review. The community clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls. Brenda, resplendent in a tailored power suit, radiated self-importance from the podium. She ran through the agenda, her voice booming, her eyes missing nothing. She got to old business, and her gaze flickered to me, a knowing, condescending smirk playing on her lips. "And now," she declared, "a brief update on the Mr. Thorne situation. As you all know, we've had some challenges with a new resident regarding the proper usage of our beautiful common area lake. I'm pleased to announce that the HOA has taken decisive action. The unauthorized vessel has been removed, and Mr. Thorne has been appropriately fined. We trust he will soon come to understand the importance of community harmony." She paused, inviting applause. A smattering of polite claps filled the air, mostly from her sycophants. I stood up calmly. "Madam President," I said, my voice cutting through the polite murmur. My voice was quiet, but it carried a deliberate contrast to her theatricality. "I believe there are some significant misunderstandings regarding the status of the lake and your authority over it. I have some information I believe the community would find illuminating." Brenda's face tightened. "Mr. Thorne, this is neither the time nor the place for personal grievances. We have a full agenda." "On the contrary," I countered, pulling out a thick binder, "this is precisely the time and precisely the place. This concerns the fundamental rights of property ownership within Windermere Point and the transparency of the HOA leadership." I looked directly at the crowd, ignoring Brenda. "I'm sure many of you have questions about the HOA's rules, fines, and how they relate to the lake. I intend to provide answers." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Brenda, caught off guard, fumbled for a moment. "I assure you, Mr. Thorne, the HOA's legal counsel has confirmed our position. The lake is a common amenity." "Indeed," I said, my voice calm, precise, like a surgeon making an incision. "Perhaps it is time to consult new counsel. I brought some documents that may shed new light on the matter." I walked to the front, placing my binder on the podium, pushing Brenda's notes aside. She glared at me, her face a mask of fury. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and steady. "For decades, perhaps since its inception, the Windermere Point Homeowners Association has operated under a fundamental misconception regarding the ownership of Lake Thorne. They have levied fines, imposed restrictions, and even recently engaged in the illegal seizure of private property based on this misunderstanding." A palpable tension filled the room. Brenda opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand, not imperiously, but with a quiet authority that stopped her cold. "I have here a copy of a land grant, dated 1887, recorded in the county clerk's office, that unequivocally establishes the original ownership of this lake." I projected a scanned image of the ancient deed onto the large screen behind the podium. The faded script was hard to read, but the highlighted portion was clear. It states that the entire bed and banks of Lake Thorne, from the high water mark inward 10 feet, were to remain perpetually under the ownership of the original grantor's family, their heirs, and assigns. I paused, letting the words sink in. That grantor's family, ladies and gentlemen, is my wife, Eleanor's ancestral family. And through her inheritance, that ownership has now passed to me. I own the lake, every square foot of its bed, and 20 feet of its surrounding shoreline. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Whispers erupted, escalating into a chorus of disbelief and shock. Brenda, her face now ash white, stammered, This is preposterous. Fabricated. The plat maps clearly show." "The plat maps, Madam President," I interjected, holding up another document, "a developer's contemporary plat, are based on a more recent survey, which, conveniently, omits this specific critical detail from the original land grant. I have consulted with a renowned real estate attorney, David Sterling, who has confirmed the irrefutable legality of this original deed. It supersedes any subsequent declarations made by the developer or the HOA concerning lake ownership." I then clicked to the next slide, revealing the court order David had secured. Furthermore, the court has seen enough preliminary evidence to issue this order, compelling the HOA to cease and desist all attempts to regulate or claim ownership of Lake Thorne, effective immediately. Any further actions will be considered contempt of court. The room erupted in pandemonium. People were on their feet, shouting, demanding answers. Brenda, her carefully constructed facade crumbling, tried to regain control. Order! Order, please. This man is disseminating false information. He is a liar. Am I, Madam President? I asked, my voice calm, almost clinical. Then perhaps you can explain why, according to the camera footage I possess, you personally directed the illegal seizure of my private property, my boat, from my private lake, just last week, an act for which you're now facing charges of conversion of property. I clicked the remote. The clubhouse's large projector screen, which had moments before displayed the old deed, now showed the crystal-clear video footage of Brenda, illuminated by the towing truck's headlights, directing the removal of my boat, her triumphant smile frozen for all to see. The murmurs turned to outright shouts of outrage. People pointed at Brenda, their faces a mixture of betrayal and anger. The Millers, the Sanchezes, Mark, their faces mirrored my vindication. She said my bird bath was vermin, cried Mrs. Miller. She made me repay my door, yelled the Sanchezes. Brenda's attempts to regain control were futile, pathetic. She shrieked, she blustered, she threatened lawsuits. But her authority, once so absolute, had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Her carefully cultivated image as the benevolent, all-knowing leader shattered. The very people who had once hung on her every word now turned on her, their faces etched with disgust. Her allies, seeing the ship sinking, discreetly melted away, pretending sudden, urgent phone calls. The power had shifted decisively and irrevocably. Brenda Albright, the HOA Baroness, was unmasked, stripped bare, and left exposed for all to see. The fallout from that HOA meeting was immediate and catastrophic for Brenda Albright. The public unmasking of her deceit and blatant abuse of power triggered a chain reaction that swept through Windermere Point like a cleansing fire. The lawsuit I had filed escalated rapidly. With the video evidence of her directing the theft of my boat, coupled with the irrefutable historical deeds, her position became untenable. The HOA's own legal counsel, faced with a potential class action lawsuit from enraged residents, quickly distanced themselves from Brenda, advising the board to settle swiftly and decisively. Brenda, for her part, tried to bluster, to deny, to threaten. But her threats now rang hollow. The legal process, once a mere annoyance to her, became an inescapable nightmare. My attorney, David Sterling, methodically dismantled every defense she attempted. The charges of conversion of property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and breach of fiduciary duty against her personally were too well documented, too irrefutable. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the unanimous condemnation of the community, she had no choice but to capitulate. She resigned from the HOA board in disgrace, a humiliated shell of her former self. The terms of the settlement were brutal, precisely tailored to ensure her complete and utter downfall. She was required to pay a substantial sum in damages for the illegal seizure of my boat and the emotional distress she had caused. More significantly, a formal injunction was issued, preventing her from ever serving on any community board or holding any position of authority within Windermere Point. The HOA, desperate to mitigate its own legal exposure, agreed to pay all my legal fees, as well as a significant portion of the damages owed by Brenda. The community, once her loyal subjects, now openly reviled her. Her expensive G-Wagon, once a symbol of her power, became a target for whispered insults and averted gazes. Her property, the grandest house in Windermere Point, became an island of isolation. Within 2 months, the for sale sign appeared on her perfectly manicured lawn, a final, public acknowledgement of her defeat. She sold it at a significant loss, desperate to escape the pervasive atmosphere of contempt. She left the community as quickly and quietly as possible, a pariah, stripped of her authority, her reputation, and her ill-gotten sense of superiority. The Baroness had fallen. Now in a position of total power over Lake Thorne, I had the unique opportunity to dictate new terms, not as a tyrant, but as a steward. My first act was to formally issue a new declaration of private ownership over the lake bed and banks, registered with the county ironclad, and impossible to dispute. But I wasn't interested in hoarding the lake. Eleanor had loved its shared joy, the laughter of children splashing in its shallows, the quiet camaraderie of local fishermen. My new terms were generous but firm. I established a new entity, the Lake Thorn Conservancy, a nonprofit foundation dedicated to the preservation, ecological health, and responsible enjoyment of the lake. I granted the Conservancy a perpetual easement for managed recreational access for the residents of Windermere Point, under strict, clearly defined rules. No motorized boats beyond my electric vessel, no littering, no disruptive behavior. Fishing would be catch and release, with a focus on sustainable practices. The 20-foot shoreline buffer, my property, would be kept wild and pristine, a natural habitat. The Conservancy would be governed by a new board of directors, elected by the community, with a focus on environmental stewardship and community well-being, not arbitrary rulemaking. I funded its initial operations myself, ensuring it would be self-sustaining through modest annual contributions from participating households, funds dedicated entirely to lake maintenance, water quality testing, and conservation efforts. The Windermere Point HOA, chastened and humbled, underwent a radical transformation. The remaining board members, thoroughly purged of Brenda's influence, resigned, and a new, ethical, and community-focused board was elected. They immediately moved to revoke dozens of Brenda's most egregious rules and fines, initiating a refund program for residents who had suffered under her arbitrary reign. The HOA's power was significantly curtailed, refocused on actual community services, not control and punishment. The residents, now empowered and united by their shared experience, ensured that the new board was truly representative of their interests. The community was demonstrably better off, freed from the oppressive shadow of Brenda Albright's tyranny. Months passed. The initial flurry of legal activity and community restructuring settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. My home, once a refuge from grief, now felt truly whole, truly mine again. The lake, no longer a battleground, returned to its serene state, its surface mirroring the peaceful sky. I spent my mornings on the porch, watching the mist rise, and my afternoons gliding silently in my electric boat, casting a line, feeling the familiar tug of a base, then gently releasing it. The laughter of children playing in the shallows, the quiet conversations of neighbors by the shoreline, the easy camaraderie of shared space. It was all restored, but this time under terms that were fair, just, and respectful. I often visited the small, quiet cove where my boat now rested, secure and unmolested. Near it, almost hidden by the tall reeds, was a small, unadorned stone plaque I had commissioned. It bore a single inscription, Lake Eleanor Thorn. It was a quiet tribute, a lasting monument to the woman who had brought me to this place, who had taught me the quiet strength of standing up for what was right, and whose legacy had ultimately gifted me the power to restore peace and justice. The sun would set, painting the lake in hues of gold and crimson, and I would sit on my porch, listening to the cicadas hum their evening song. The moral of the story, I realized, was multifaceted. Bullies, driven by their own inflated sense of importance, ultimately defeat themselves. True power, the kind that endures, doesn't come from a clipboard or a condescending tone, but from knowledge, from diligence, from the quiet, methodical pursuit of truth. And sometimes, the most unassuming individual, the one seeking peace, holds the most potent weapon. I had wanted only quietude, a sanctuary to heal. What I found was a forgotten legacy, a dormant power, and the profound satisfaction of ensuring that justice, like the lake itself, found its proper level. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if an HOA, Karen, tried to ban your boat from the water.